Now, there are safety concerns ahead of the Australian Open after poor air quality led to tennis matches being abandoned and even forced one player to retire after struggling to breathe. Officials there say the widespread bushfires have left Melbourne with the worst air quality in the world.
Well, more than 100 fires are still burning across Australia. This is what some of them look like from up above. This is the state of New South Wales, and you can see the volume of smoke. Now, we've talked many times about how that smoke is affecting life in cities like Sydney and Canberra, but it's affecting Melbourne too as well. Have a look at some of these pictures. This is the city blanketed in smoke. The air quality has been described as hazardous. We know lots of people have been choosing to wear face masks, as you can see in this footage. The smoke's also disrupted the qualifying stages of the Melbourne Open, the Australian Open tennis tournament. One player collapsed and complained of breathing difficulties, and as you can see, she had to be helped off court. The smoke also isn't just affecting Australia. We know it's reached South America last week, and this graphic from NASA, using NASA data, shows that in fact the smoke is completing a full circuit of the globe. Now, the Australian media is an important part of the bushfire story. Rupert Murdoch's News Corp dominates the media landscape in Australia. It publishes more than 140 newspapers, employs around 3,000 journalists across print, broadcast and online. And critics say Mr Murdoch's newspapers and TV networks have continued to publish stories and opinion pieces that dismiss widely accepted science about climate change, which makes this story in the Daily Beast worthy of note. Rupert Murdoch's son, James Murdoch, sits on the News Corp board. A spokesperson for him and his wife, Catherine, say their views on climate are well established and their frustration with some of News Corp and Fox coverage of the topic is also well known. They are particularly disappointed with the ongoing denial among the news outlets in Australia, given obvious evidence to the contrary. So strong stuff, and there are different examples that we could highlight. Sometimes it's simply an issue of emphasis. Here we have the front page of the Australian newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch on the day that Australia hit its highest ever average temperature. The choice of lead story? Well, they chose to go with a story about coal exports. Other times things are more explicit. We know that across the last 100 years, Australia's climate has been getting warmer and warmer, particularly in the last 25. This is data from the Bureau of Meteorology there. And meteorologists are telling us that hotter, drier climate increases the risk of bushfire seasons being longer and more intense. And you'll find examples of the Murdoch media questioning that. So here is a quote from one columnist, News Corp columnist Chris Kenny, writing in the Australian newspaper, "Hysterical efforts to blame the fires on climate change continue, even though we've always faced this threat and always will." And here's another News Corp columnist, Andrew Bolt, speaking on his programme on the Murdoch-owned Sky News Australia.
The global warming hysteria right now is insane. Once again, I heard not a single voice of doubt on a national broadcaster this morning that actually this drought, no, it's not caused by global warming, nor are the bushfires, nor will it help at all with bushfires to cut our emissions. Instead, we had politicians who should know better. They're out there, they're feeding the fear and the misinformation.
Well, the Australian newspapers pushed back at its critics. It tweeted an editorial over the weekend saying, "Our factual account of bushfires, climate change and the remedies, as well as our editorial commentary on these issues, have been willfully and ineptly misinterpreted as climate denial." And that language is familiar. Go back to 2015. Here's a tweet by Rupert Murdoch, who owns The Australian, saying, "A climate change sceptic, not a denier." And he also goes on to talk about alarmist nonsense. Now, describe all this however you choose. What we can be certain of is that, one, commentators seeking to distance the fires and climate change are being given space in the Australian media owned by Rupert Murdoch, and climate scientists are clear in saying the broader pattern of climate change and the weather it brings does increase the risk of extreme fires. Now, the important thing to note here is that whatever conclusions are drawn about the bushfires have political consequences in Australia, not least for its enormous coal industry. The Prime Minister turned to this when speaking to ABC News at the weekend.
We are going to continue to evolve our policy in this area to reduce emissions even further, and we're going to do it without a carbon tax, without putting up electricity
so if you can do it
prices,
without a carbon tax and putting up prices,
and without shutting down traditional industries upon which regional Australians depend for their very livelihood.
They do.
That's what I took to the Australian people.
But are you willing to use this?
But this matter may, in the end, be taken out of the hands of politicians and the fossil fuel industry. Have a look at this. BlackRock is the world's largest fund manager. It's dumping, and has announced today it's dumping more than $500 million in thermal coal shares. This is part of a more active stance on climate change, it says. In a letter sent to a range of chief executives of the world's largest companies, BlackRock's founder says climate change has become a defining factor in companies' long-term prospects. He goes on, we do not believe that the long-term economic or investment rationale justifies continued investment in this sector. That may be, but for the moment, the coal industry maintains the support of Scott Morrison and his government, and the passionate support of some high-profile Australian commentators on Rupert Murdoch's wage bill.